Good evening and welcome to The Report with me, Jonathan Steele. In the USA, the governor of the state of Missouri has sent the National Guard into the town of Ferguson as protests escalate after the fatal shooting of an unarmed black teenager. The unrest will, of course, remind viewers of events here in the UK in 2011 after the shooting of Mark Duggan, and of numerous instances in France where second and third generation immigrants have clashed with police. But the events in Ferguson have escalated to such a point that comparisons are now being made with the race riots in Los Angeles of 1992. Governor Jay Nixon called in the Guard, in his words, to help restore peace and order and to protect the citizens of Ferguson. Islam Channel's Nathaniel Amos Sansam brings us this video report.
The Missouri National Guard rolled through the streets of Ferguson this morning in a show of force designed to quell the communal violence following the shooting of an unarmed black teenager 2 weeks ago. What followed has been some of the worst racially charged violence seen in America for over a generation. For Missouri's governor, the move comes after numerous failed attempts to ease tensions.
I signed an order declaring a state of emergency and ordering the implementation of a curfew in the impacted area of Ferguson. Again, this is not to silence the people of Ferguson or this region or others, but to contain those who are drowning out the voice of the people with their actions. We will not allow a handful of looters to endanger the rest of this community.
The violence began as a peaceful protest by a community in mourning, following the death of 18-year-old Michael Brown, a high school student who was shot dead by police officer Darren Wilson on August the 9th. However, the police did not disclose the name of the officer for over a week, and a later autopsy showed that the unarmed Brown had been shot at least 6 times. In response, the mostly African-American community of Ferguson took to the streets to condemn the police action and demand justice for the family of Michael Brown. After initial protests were met with arrests, the mood on the street turned steadily more violent, with scenes of violence and looting over many nights. Speaking on the escalating conflict last week, the president called for peace and transparency in the community.
There is never an excuse for violence against police or for those who would use this tragedy as a cover for vandalism or looting. There's also no excuse for police to use excessive force against peaceful protests or to throw protesters in jail for lawfully exercising their First Amendment rights. And here in the United States of America, police should not be bullying or arresting journalists who are just trying to do their jobs and report to the American people on what they see on the ground.
We're down about 45 seconds. Let's go.
However, the police reaction to the escalating violence has been widely criticized as the use of excessive force. Here, the Washington Post journalist Wesley Lowery filmed his own arrest by police in Ferguson for not leaving the vicinity of the conflict quickly enough. And on Friday, the local police department released its incident report, which included security footage which it said linked Brown to a store robbery they were responding to. Brown's family and numerous senior politicians and activists have criticized the move as character assassination.
In all of my life, I've never seen nothing more despicable than while this mother and this father and their families haven't even had the time to bury their son, the police chief would release a tape trying to disparage his name while his mama's still weeping, while the family hasn't even laid him to rest. How can the young folk of the city believe in a system that would try to spit on the name and character of a young man who hasn't even been buried?
In the American suburb, deep tensions have been exposed between a mainly white police force accused of racial profiling and a black community that feels that the law is working against them, and all sides fear an escalation of the violence if the situation is not brought under control. Nathaniel Amos Sansam, Islam Channel.
Well, to discuss with me the events in Ferguson and the issues the demonstrations have raised, I'm joined in the studio by Butler, a writer and activist, and Simon Woolley, co-founder and director of Operation Black Vote. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, if I may, Butler. I mean, unfortunately, it's not the first time a young black man's been shot by police. Why do you think it's become such a turbulent issue in Ferguson?
I think that it's the issue of this dreadful character assassination that has come forward I think it's one of the keys in really ramping up the sense of urgency and the sense of utter helplessness in the minds of people who, in some ways, feel that the level of racial oppression is practically tantamount to occupation, where this situation really has kind of muddied the waters, if you will. The idea that any young black man who does anything at all then is responsible for their own daylight execution is absolutely hideous. And I think that that is one factor that is very much responsible for the escalation in violence.
I mean, is it partly, Simon Woolley, kind of segregation of law and order? The police force seems to be almost entirely white, even though it's a black majority community, yes. Isn't it?
I mean, it's not just the segregation of law and order between the people and the police. It's really the segregation of American authority and American power and the black community. You know, what follows after a tragedy, a shocking death of this nature exposes really the shocking inequality of African Americans and the American system. And I guess when you get this type of outpouring, it's really African Americans saying why the shocking injustice time and time again, not just between them and the police, but also between them and jobs, them and education. It's an outpouring. In many ways, it seems to some parts of America that it is wanton violence. And for the other side, it's a plea for help. It's a plea to demand that they get treated like human beings, that you have a state that works for them and not against them. And this is just really the straw that breaks the camel's back that we're seeing.
Susan Butler, I mean, we saw President Obama there on the screen. I mean, you know, he's been in power 6 years, he's a black man. Has he really been able to change any of this huge divide between blacks and whites in the poorer communities, at least in America?
I don't know if it's possible for a single individual or a single appointment or a single success to achieve what we've been working for, indeed, for hundreds of years. And I'm certain that the designation of America as this post-racial society with the election of President Obama was not just premature, but a total red herring. Because if you want to see whether or not the U.S. is a racially equal society, don't look at who's in the White House, look at who's in the prisons.
Now they're bringing in, sorry to interrupt you.
Yes, no, I think that's very true, that we should look at the mass incarceration of African Americans at a whole-scale level. But also, too, is that in some ways, the fantastic, I guess, moment that we had when we elected a black man in the White House, and the first African American, actually has meant that people have taken their eye off the ball when it comes to tackling race inequality. Equally, what happens there also happens here in the UK, that because you have a black person in power, that they then become hamstrung to say the type of things that you need to tackle these shocking gaps. So time and time again, even when we have Trayvon Martin or this particular case, you see the African-American president dancing on a pin, saying, yes, we need to have law and order, and yet we need to respect black people, instead of saying what is patently obvious to most African Americans, that we still live in a divide and rule country, that African Americans are not afforded equality of opportunity in any shape or form in so many areas of their lives.
I mean, the situation in Ferguson is still extremely tense. Now the governor's sending in the National Guard. Do you think that's going to make it better or worse?
I can't imagine that police officers who are armed like the soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, in tanks that can withstand mine explosions and IEDs with live rounds aimed at civilians, is going to be a good thing in any way. These are people who are under siege in a lot of subtle and nuanced ways, and experience a lot of forms of violence, and now this overtly militarized violence that's happening on the streets of Ferguson I can't see as even suppressing what's to come.
Well, we've actually had some tweets. There's one from Troy Baker who says, very much in line with what you're saying, the military was not and is not designed to police the populace of the country. It was created to protect. It is an invading force.
I worry about the ramifications, not just for Ferguson, this town, but the whole of America and beyond, you know, here in the UK and across Europe. At the moment, there is this kind of toxic immigration debate which demonizes people of color in this country, in Europe, and in the USA. And of course, we've seen the Tea Party exploit moments like this to say, look, white people are law-abiding and look what black people do. This explosion of feeling of desperateness not only doesn't help in terms of how we deal with race equality, but it also further divides an already divided America. And I'm just sorry that President Obama cannot stand up and say what needs to be said. And if not him, then maybe Hillary Clinton. But we need a real leader who's able to speak truth to power and give people hope in a desperate situation that acknowledges what's occurring. Whilst of course we say, look, yes, we need law and order, but you cannot get law and order until you have equality. I
think on that point, we'll have to leave it there. I'm afraid our time has run out. We're going to go now to our first break, but join us shortly after that when we'll be discussing the case of Talha Hassan, who was extradited to the US and served a custodial sentence before being released and cleared to return to the UK now. More after the break.